This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On November 20th, our member John Thompson gave the final Military History Night lecture for the fall 2013 season. He spoke to us on the topic, "What did Grandpa do in the Great War?" and how you can find out.
I take it, since this is being recorded, I can't use my outdoor or the Sergeant Major voice and speak without the mic because, among other things, Eric will get very upset with me. Long and short of it, of course, is that we're always told, especially when you're a junior officer, keep a nice simple mission, make it very simple. Instead, what I'm doing is actually kind of complicated. I'm trying to blend together two narratives. One is the narrative that I discovered about an episode in my own family history. The other one is the narrative of how we learned about all the details. And it actually was kind of an interesting process, an interesting discovery. But of course, the other point is that it is actually really, really easy to do First World War research. And if you haven't done any, especially if you were talking about Canadian relatives, the real question is, what's keeping you? With a little bit of practice, I've got to the stage where I've been going through the list of the First World War dead from my old university fraternity, and I can actually turn up everything I need to know in about half an hour. And it's really that simple that anybody can do it. I'll point out a little bit later, there's some other pitfalls, especially if you're trying to, say, get information about the Second World War, which is much more difficult, or if you're dealing with another military entirely. The first point, of course, is that, as many of you may know, that veterans, especially combat veterans, don't talk much about their experiences. They'll say general things. They'll talk about general service, examples of service. But again, a family example, I had my Uncle Pat, who landed on D-Day in World War II and was still with the same battalion 11 months later in VE Day, and managed to come through all that time without a physical scratch on him. But I never learned a thing about what he'd done in those 11 months with the, I think in fact, I'm not even sure what regiment it was. I think it was the Queen's Own Rifles, but it's been a little difficult to find out. The point was that I learned more about him from a chance episode when he was in a family visit. I was 7 and he was in a cot in my bedroom and he woke up screaming in the night with a thunderstorm. Took him back someplace where he didn't want to be. But, that was kind of educational. Did I ever learn did he ever tell us anything about what he experienced in those 11 months? Not one anecdote. And if he was a little closed-mouthed, my grandfather was actually notoriously closed-mouthed. He was, I think actually if I looked up in a dictionary under the word laconic, and it would probably be his picture there. So the family learned nothing at all about his time in the First World War, except that he'd been with the Canadian Forestry Corps. That was all he ever said. And of course, it was known he had an older brother who died during the war. But again, nothing was ever said about it. We knew that his name was on a church in Brockville, but that was it. No details, no other information, nothing forthcoming. And as the years went by, we just basically all forgot about things. And of course, here's the point, is that, you remember that First World War song, that we'll never tell them. I mean, even here at the RCMI, we know that some of our veterans with more colorful tales to tell don't tell them. Except maybe in their 80s and 90s, and then maybe they'd start to let some information leak out about some of their more hazardous experiences. I haven't got a picture, actually. It's an oversight. I didn't think about it till this morning. I haven't got a picture of my grandfather in his old age, but just to introduce you to him, John Kahn. Now, here's the interesting bit. Remember this. Born January 1st, 1901. Basically the first day of the 20th century, and that's when he was born. Ardrossan, Scotland, which is just outside of Glasgow. Family immigrated to Canada in 1912, took up in Brockville. He married in 1926, Isabel Menin He was farming in Vancouver Island very unsuccessfully in the 1920s, and of course the Depression made things even worse. It was a hard time for the family. Then he got a new job in the late 1930s as a mine foreman in Pioneer Mine in the BC interior, a gold mine, and actually did quite well there. Now, he had 3 daughters, and between them they produced 12 grandchildren, Thompsons, Kerrs, and Dents. Counting on my fingers, 24 grandchildren and at least 3 great-great-grandchildren that I've heard about. That's an assortment of his descendants, including 2 of his daughters and everybody else there. So, this is a person who built Canada and certainly made a substantial contribution to populating Canada. And I guess the last thing about him is that he died fairly neatly and quietly, as he did all things in his life, in February 1967. He was basically driving down a mountain highway with my grandmother in BC interior, pulled over to one side, said, "I'll be going now," closed his eyes and died. And just, that was sort of the quiet competence he did in most things. Now, for me, I'd heard that he'd been involved in the First World War. I was a young child, and this was even before I'd heard my uncle, screaming in the night. I had ideas. He must have, desperate adventures, tanks, flamethrowers, planes. He must have had lots of stories about fighting Germans and everything else. And we had a family reunion in the summer of 1966, just before I turned 7. And I was very excited to try and pick his brains and find out some of these great, amazing stories that he must have to tell. And all I got was a look that years later, I think I understood the expression. It was sort of, complete puzzlement. What do you want to know all that stuff for? And not a single story was forthcoming. And again, all anyone ever knew was that he'd been in the Canadian Forestry Corps in the First World War. That was all he ever said. And that his older brother, George Denholm Kahn, had died during the war, but as I said before, that was all forgotten. Other than the fact that he had lived briefly and had died in the service. And of course, there's another story which I won't tell tonight unless I really speed through my allotted time. And of course, there was another great uncle, the Isabel Main's baby brother, who was killed with the RCF in 1943. And of course, that was another research story, and there's certainly some pitfalls there. Well, a few years ago, my mother was closing up her home. My dad had died back in the mid-1990s. But she was going into a retirement home, so we started to, go through the filing cabinets, pick up, how the process is. And, you keep coming across objects that you've got memories with, things that you've got all sorts of associations with. And there was a filing cabinet with letters that, been there for a long, long time, and all sorts of little strange things, It's a bit of a discovery when you find out your parents had a nickname for you, when you were 2, and what that nickname was and what it meant, that sort of thing. But there were a couple of pictures in there that I'd not seen before. So pull them out, and here we got 2 people in uniform of the Canadian Army uniform of the First World War. Who were they? And talked to Mom, and she said, "Well, that one I recognize, the one on the left. That's my grandfather in uniform in World War I." I did ask you to remember his birth date, January 1st, 1901. So that was the first question for me, because by this time I'd spent years reading military history and other things, and sort of, okay, what the hell is he doing in uniform when he's in the middle of his teenage years? It's not, you were not allowed to join the CEF until you were 18, and you would not go overseas until you're 19. What's he doing in uniform? That was the first question that really intrigued my curiosity. And of course, then this other fellow is his older brother. And, okay, who is he? And my brothers and I looked at each other, and we realized we didn't know anything about him. So we asked Mom, and she said, "Oh, well, he joined the Army and was killed 9 months later." And that's all she remembered. And so, okay, time to find out who these people were and what the story was. Well, in Canada, World War I research is really, really easy. And the first place you go is on the internet. Thanks to the Archives of Canada, a couple of history teachers who basically dragooned their students into working for it. There's the basic document, the attestation paper, the basic recruiting document, which is the foundation of our whole military service package. Canada, all the attestation papers, well over 1 million of them, are all available on the net. They've all been turned into PDF files available for the Archives of Canada. So it's not like you have to make a trip to Ottawa and say, okay, go to the archives and say, I'm looking for so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, and then hope after a couple of hours a civil servant might give you a photocopy of the paper. You can get on the net and do it yourself. And it's really simple. This is the attestation paper. There's two kinds. This is the longer complex form, which was used basically until 1917, which they had more of an abbreviated one. This is the one for George Denholm Kahn. I put the link used to actually get attestation papers up at the top. If any of you are interested, afterwards drop me an email and I'll send you a copy of this presentation and you can look at the link. But basically, www.collectionscanada.gc.ca and start hunting. They'll lead you there really fast because it's a well-traveled path, and thousands upon thousands of Canadians are looking for attestation papers every day. But the key thing about the attestation paper is, remember, you've got to make sure, if you're trying to find out more, you've got the right person. One of the big advantages in my life with a name like John Thompson is there are pages and pages and pages of us in the Toronto phone book. If you know anything about me, you know I've spent most of my adult life causing trouble and annoying people like, Tamil Tigers and Mohawk warriors and some of our jihadist chums. Secure in the knowledge that a John Thompson is very, very hard to find unless you know more about him. And truth to tell, I'm very hard to find. Now imagine you were looking for a J. Thompson in World War I attestation papers in Canada. You'd turn up tens of thousands of attestation papers. So you've got to narrow it down a bit. If you're going to look, the first thing you need to know is the person's name. In this case, we knew the name George Denholm Kahn. Denholm is a very unusual middle name. Kahn, C-O-N-N, isn't a very common last name. We also knew, because we were told that his name was recorded in the church in Brockville, that's where he'd come from. So obviously, place of enlistment and name. So we get into the attestation paper, start doing the data search, looking for George Denholm Kahn. Not too many matches. In fact, there was only one. So this was really, really difficult. From there, especially the beginning part of the war, there's a couple of key things you need to find out, and the attestation paper will give it to you. Apparently this has got a real cool laser in here, but somewhere in there, and it's very hard because it's in faint pencil, is his service number. And once you have the service number and the right name, that's it. You've got the key for everything. And away you go. It's really quite simple. The rest of the details can be quite interesting. Who he listed as next of kin, his home address. And again, that's a final confirming point. If you're looking for a George Smith, have you got the right address? Because again, say in a place like Brockville might have had 3 or 4 George Smiths. How can you tell you've actually got the right one? And a general physical description. If looking back at the photograph of George Denholm Kahn, he was actually a young man, pretty good looking, and again, the physical description, sandy hair, fair eyes. Actually, he must have been a really good looking kid. Except he was a quarryman in a quarry near Brockville, so he was basically, well set, cutting stone all day will do that to you. So they snapped him up quite fast. The other thing is that you have his immediate assignment to the 13th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. You remember in the First World War that, the North Saskatchewan Dragoons or the Eastern Ontario Regiment didn't go over as themselves. They got repackaged by our maniac defense minister into numbered battalions. So it's 4th Battalion, 13th Battalion, 20th Battalion, what have you, the CEF. So he got assigned to the 13th Battalion of the CEF. And right off, I didn't need to do anything else from that point. Because actually this is where I took the flying shortcut. I knew enough about the First World War to know what had happened to the 13th Battalion, the CEF, 9 months after he joined up in August 1914. He was signed up, he was still 18, but he basically went off. As soon as Canada started mobilizing, he volunteered. So he must have gone through that whole mess in Valcartier and then emerged out the far side of it. But I knew that he was killed. So the next place I looked, Veterans Canada maintains, the books of remembrance we have in the Peace Tower. They maintain them there's a virtual book up there as well. So I had his serial number, and I had his name, and it was really easy, 1915, if he died 9 months after August 1914. So it was very easy to find him in there. And that gave actually the unit he was with. So it confirmed that he died with the 13th Battalion in 1915. Didn't give the exact date, but I still needed to confirm that, because the 13th Battalion was in several actions, but there's only one place to go, the definitive place, the definitive place that lists all Commonwealth casualties. And their work is quite sacred. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they've got a huge web presence. Why? Because how many millions of people have joined Commonwealth armies in the 20th century, and they keep track of all of them and all of their graves. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they are overworked. They're trying like heck to be as responsive as they can. But I sent them an email. I said that I was looking for my great uncle, who I knew he died in 1915. I knew the battalion. Here was his service number and everything else. And in about 2 days, they sent back an email that said exactly when he died and exactly where he's buried. In his case, he was killed on the 22nd of April, 1915. And that was the real kicker. That answered everything I needed to know right then. And that's, again, because that's actually a very, very historical moment. The other point, of course, was that he's got no known graves. Most of the people who died in that battle and who were Canadians have no known graves. He's listed on the Menin Gate. But, just to round things up and to see if there's any mention that where he might have gone, if he actually crept into the history books. I did consult a few, particularly made use of Dan Daycock's Welcome to Flanders Fields, although Tim Cook's books, of course, they weren't out yet when I was doing this work. But again, they probably wouldn't have mentioned him either. But just because I'm going to exercise bragging rights, in case you don't know, 22nd April 1915 is the beginning of the Second Battle of Ypres. I mean, Ypres is, right down here, is the cockpit of the Western Front in World War I. There were 5 major battles around the city. Basically, it was the last city in Belgium to stay out of German hands. More to the point, the Belgians flooded the canal north of the city. And so if the Germans were ever going to get through and around to the channel points, to basically do what they did in 1940, seal off the British Army by capturing the channel ports that fed them, they'd have to go through Ypres. So they made several attempts to capture it. 22nd of April, the first big German offensive of the spring. There was the Canadian line here around the Ypres salient. These were the French lines, and there's the Belgians up here. This was the day of the first poison gas attack in history that worked. The big chlorine gas attack. And basically the French on the left of the Canadians evaporated. Big rolling cloud of chlorine gas, nobody having any protections. They all disappeared. And then you had this huge gap right on the left of the Canadian line. So here are the Canadians oriented towards their front. Suddenly they're enveloped on 3 sides. The 13th Battalion were right there, right at the very edge of it all. And so they had, it was a desperate fight for the 1st Canadian Division and a desperate fight indeed for the 13th Battalion. Basically about 2/3 of their strength were killed, wounded, or missing in the next 2 days before they were pulled out. Don't know the particular circumstances of how my great uncle died, just know that he did. This is the brooding soldier. He's one of the first memorials ever done to Canadian soldiers. This is right up, just a little north here about St. Julian, right about there. So somewhere within a kilometer of that site is where, to the north and to the east, somewhere in these big flat fields was the point where he was killed, but, who knows where. The other point, of course, is that there was 3 other battles around Ypres in the next 3.5 years. The town got turned into rubble. We all know historically, I mean, if you ever saw that movie Passchendaele, actually, it's a pretty good depiction of what the ground and the conditions were like for the Third Battle of Ypres, which is also Passchendaele. Then the fourth battle was the German counterattack in the spring of 1918. The fifth battle that finally drove the Germans out of artillery range of that much battered city. And of course, the Germans have their huge war grave at Langemark, and they've got basically about 300,000 dead from around the various battles around the city. The British Empire, including us, have about 300,000 dead, plus some French and Belgians. And of them, about 90,000 have no known graves. So they built the Menin Gate, started to list the missing on it, and ran out of room. It covers about 56,000 names. The rest of them are up in Tynecott Cemetery. But I went to Belgium, had a look, found the panel, and found his name with the rest of about 400 from the 13th Battalion, including Canada's first Victoria Cross of World War I, Fred Fisher, who was a Lance Corporal who was killed on the 23rd when he tried to repeat what he did on the 22nd, and his actions that day got him the Victoria Cross. And for all I know, I mean, I'd like to believe maybe one chance in 30 that maybe one of the 10 men that was with him on the 22nd of April might have been my great uncle. There's no way of knowing. But that was it. Finding out about George Denholm and Kahn was pretty simple. Attestation paper, confirmed I had the right guy, got a service number, Commonwealth War Graves, confirmed the day he died. The rest was just a resort to history books because it was such a famous encounter. You didn't really need to do any more research. So with that, I then turned to my grandfather, and that's where things got, well, even more interesting. My teenage grandfather had 4 attestation papers. This was interesting. Okay, how the hell did he get 4? Well, dig them all out and start looking. First one is August 25th, 1914. In other words, his older brother goes down to join up. He has to come along too. And he proudly declares that actually on the reverse side that he's got some military experience. He's a drummer in the band for the Brockville Rifles. So of course, they must need bandsmen. They must need drummer boys. Of course you can go to war. And get out of here, kid. Go home. So his first attempt to join up in August 1914 doesn't work. His brother is killed April 22nd. About 3 weeks later, the telegram arrives. That's the second attestation paper. His reaction? Try to enlist. And again, okay, kid, you're 14, get out of here. So he goes home. He waits a full year. A year to the, basically in May 1916, he makes his third attempt. This time, that traditional Scottish rectitude is starting to evaporate. He's starting to get a little vague about where he was born. Instead of being very precise and writing out the exact town, he sort of said, I was born in Scotland. A little vague about who his parents were, and he tries to add on a couple of years to his age. Except I think someone in the recruiting office must have remembered him, because get out of here, kid, get lost. This is the fourth attestation paper, and it's the one that worked. He added 3 years to his age, and basically said place of birth, Scotland, a few other little things, and they let him in. Of course, not much else is in there, but again, it was interesting. He described himself as being born in January 1st, 1898, so he was, honest, I'm 18, really? You can take me in, and next year, January 1st, I turn 19, I can go overseas, right? So here he is, 15-year-old kid in uniform on his way to World War I. Now that is not much to go on. I've got his attestation papers, but the easy stuff, the Book of Remembrance and all this Commonwealth War Graves, that applies if you died. Granddad came home. So what next? Well, the next thing is the Archives of Canada. Now, they are still old-fashioned archives. Everyone's got their service package, and in some cases they're quite lengthy. But if you are a relative if you have the right military, the right service number, the right town they joined from, the right name, and again with John Kahn, it was all quite simple. I could order his service package, and it basically it's about $10 for photocopying and mailing. It takes about 3 weeks. You have to write them a letter. You have to point out that you are a relative and you would really like to see the service package, or make a convincing case, because I've been, I kind of whetted my appetite for World War I research, and I've been doing a lot of it since. So they're kind of used to letters from me now, because I've been looking up everyone from my fraternity and some of the more famous war dead from my regiment and digging their packages up too. But again, you find out where to go with Collections Canada, and that's the guide that'll tell you about what you have to do, the steps you have to go, the check you have to write, where you have to send it to, and they will send you the service package. And the service package is quite interesting. There's all sorts of stuff in there. His whole document package will contain his attestation papers, in this case more copies of all 4, his pay book, medical records, when he went on leave, all sorts of other little things. Now, I'll warn you that there might be things you might not really want to know about in there. For example, if you're looking at a soldier's pay book and there's an interruption in pay, that means either of 2 things. One, he's in the glass house doing a little bit of jail time for some infraction, in which case they stopped his pay. Or if he picked up an interesting social disease, they stopped his pay while he was in that particular hospital as well. So, again, be careful what you ask for. You might find out things you didn't want to know. However, his service package was actually kind of empty of detail. So the next thing I needed to do was actually start looking up war diaries. And the war diaries, every unit, every battalion, every regiment, in some cases, like in the Canadian Forestry Corps, companies, maintains a daily war diary of significant events. This is the basis for all subsequent histories. It's the basis, it's the official record of what was going on. In Canada, the war diaries are all available online as PDF files. Once again, we've made it super easy, and you can just follow the trail. Once again, collectionscanada.gc.ca, and then start looking for war diaries. Now the point is, this is going to take a while, because they're all PDF files, so they're very slow to load. And each file might be only 3 or 4 days. So you need to know the unit you're looking for and the time you're looking for, and then you start pouring into it. But again, the war diaries reveal much. Now the thing is, I was just sort of being systematic. Canadian Forestry Corps doesn't sound very exciting. In case you weren't familiar with them, the Canadian Forestry, there's tremendous appetite for lumber in wartime. And shipping was at a premium, especially with all the war material coming over and the U-boats sinking ships like crazy. So the British had the idea of actually recruiting Canadian lumberjacks to do lumbering, and they started hacking down forests in Scotland, England, and France at record pace. Because after all, Canadians, lumberjacks, right? That's actually Canadian Forestry Corps types at work. Yo he ho, we're all good, hardy men of the wild woods, and can cut down trees like nobody else can, right? Perfect. And most of them were actually working in Scotland and Western France. But I still looked, okay, because he was transferred to, I think, number 25 company. Okay, who were they? Anything unusual about them? Where did grandfather sit the war out? And this is where things got interesting again. 230th Battalion went over to the UK, immediately broken up like most late-numbered battalions for replacements. He gets assigned to 25 Company, Canadian Forestry Corps, 17 February 1917, basically farmed out there the day he arrives in France. What was unusual about the 25th Company was that they weren't up in Scotland or Western France. They were actually attached to the 3rd British Army as a company of laborers assigned to a British Army. And they were working in the Valley of the Somme. So, okay, this obviously means my grandfather was having a much more interesting war than he ever advertised. He was within the sound of the guns. And I start reading through the war diaries. Occasional air raid, detaching work parties to stockpile ammunition and artillery positions before major offensives. clearing casualties after major offensives, which must have been a real eye-opener for a 16-year-old kid, building defensive positions. Of course, the other point is that as the war ground on, the manpower crisis continued. You also read through the war diary of this company, and you suddenly find that first they're being assigned Chinese laborers as well. So my grandfather's suddenly working alongside Chinese, and as like a Scotsman, probably be wondering what the hell they were doing there. The next you start in sort of multicultural infusion were Russian refugees that were stranded in France after the Russian Revolution. So some of these guys were assigned to the Canadian Forestry Corps. So now he's got to learn or listen to Cantonese and Russian. And then after that, they start putting in German POWs to round out the manpower. And at the same time, the real manpower crisis occurred in March and April of 1918. That's when the Germans uncorked their big spring offensives. In fact, it might not be generally remembered, but they came very close to winning the war that month. I mean, it really rocked the British back quite a bit. The Canadian Forestry Corps starts spending 2 days a week musketry, section tactics, learning support weapons. In other words, there was already being earmarked that, okay, we'll get these other odd bodies, drop them into these units, pull the Canadians out slowly, train them up as replacements for frontline service. Even though the crisis occurred in March 1918, actually that was the only record he had in that whole time, the 20 months he spent, because they sent him off to Scotland for 2 weeks' leave. No stoppages of pay, I'm pleased to report, or anything else, no trips to hospital. And I'm sort of thinking, okay, nice quiet war. Obviously they realized maybe he was fibbing about his age and they didn't look too closely. And then I suddenly noticed this one last little line. 2nd of October, he's transferred to the 4th Battalion of the CEF. So here it is, the last 6 weeks of the war. I mean, the war is at its height, and the Canadian Corps is desperately short on men, and they pull him in. 100 men are pulled out of his particular company and fired off as replacements, and he's one of them. Okay, he never told anybody anything about this. Frontline service is a complete mystery to us. So naturally I had to go scampering over and pull up the war diary for the 4th Battalion CEF, and it was an eyeful. You have to remember the general situation. I mean, I've been doing some work on the 20th Battalion, which is sort of the Queen's York Rangers battalion. August 8th, Amiens, the start of the 100 Days Offensive, they had 1,200 men on strength. October 2nd, when they finished crossing the Canal de Sceaux near Cambrai, end of the day, and their second VC action of the war, they had 300 men left on their feet. And in those last 2 months, between August 8th and October 2nd, they'd also got in 300 replacements. So basically, think about it, 80% casualties up to that point. So you can imagine what the situation was like. When I start looking through the 4th Battalion, I start looking as of 2nd October, and that's the day they reorganized from 4 rifle companies down to 3. So they're having problems maintaining the strength. They are under strength. So is most of the rest of the Canadian Army. October 4th, there's an annotation in the war diaries, received 100 replacements from the Canadian Forestry Corps, farmed out immediately to rifle companies. Okay, that's unequivocal. My grandfather ends up as a rifleman in an infantry platoon in the last month of the war. And the next entry after that is nothing much except that he's evacuated to the base hospital in the Canadian Corps rear area on 23rd October with influenza. That's interesting, but okay, so he's basically about just shy of 3 weeks in the front line. And go through the war diary. What happened? Well, the war diary is quite fascinating. They were in reserve, then they spent actually 11 days, and this is the time that the Germans were caving in. The Germans just couldn't hold the line anymore. Everything they built had crumbled, and it was just falling back all along the line. But those of you, remember what the Germans were like in World War II. When the Germans are in retreat, they're still pretty stubborn. They don't retreat; they have to be pushed. So, Canadians, or the 4th Battalion, is part of the general advance, pushing the Germans further back. So every day they've got encounters with rearguard machine gun posts, artillery fire, chemical weapons, a lot. So he had quite an interesting day. or interesting time. Now, basically the 11 days of combat, 11 dead, 31 wounded. Doesn't sound like much. But when you consider it's an understrength infantry battalion, that's about 10% casualties for that period of time, which is okay. That means it was fairly serious fighting. That's the only thing I've got to go on, just to sort of measure it against other people's experiences of combat, just what their casualty rate was. But the other thing was that they were advancing through small French villages. This is an area that's full of little small mining villages, 15 or 20 houses around a pit head somewhere. And the thing is, these were French civilians who'd been under German occupation for basically almost 4 years now, since September of 1914. And the other thing was that Germany, of course, was going through a food crisis. They were not, especially in 1918, the crunch really hit. They were not going to waste food on French civilians. So they come in to these villages, and these villages are all sickly, underweight children, women, very, very old men, and nobody else. All the men are gone. They either went off to the French army or were conscripted for labor by the Germans. And they're starving. But the point is that when the Germans retreat, they tend to do a full-scale demolitions package as they go. So all the roads have, every intersection has got a deep crater in it where they blew a demolition package. All the bridges are cut. So in the war diary of the 4th Battalion, they're having a hard time getting rations to the troops. But at the same time, they notice the troops are coming in. And they're sharing all their food with starving civilians. Then they go out the next day and keep pushing the Germans back. But the weather is also being noted. It was raining non-stop in those 2 weeks. In fact, no time in trenches, but it was ankle-deep mud everywhere they went. They were always soaked to the skin. So when they stop on the 23rd and the next division passes through to continue the advance, I don't think it was much of a surprise that a 17-year-old kid like my grandfather would have been down flat in his back with influenza and was evacuated out to hospital. Released to light duties at the depot in Ypres. You may remember the scene of the 1917 mutiny on November 8th, and that's where he is on Armistice Day. So that was basically his war. But there was one other little mystery that popped up. It was actually quite the surprise. As a result of the Halifax explosion in December 1917, one of the places that really got damaged in Halifax was the rail yard. And when the war ended, we suddenly had a problem because we had hundreds of thousands of Canadians in Europe who all wanted to come home immediately. The British offered as much shipping as we wanted. The shortage in getting Canadians home from Europe was not because the British being parsimonious with shipping. It was the fact that Halifax could handle 30,000 men a month. Basically, the rail yard could take an average of 100 men a day and get them on passenger trains back home. So that was the deadlock. And of course, we know some of the history, that there were Canadians still there, units were still there in June, July of 1919, really itching to come home. But here's my grandfather, back in the UK in 9th of January 1919. This is a surprise. Shipped back to Canada on 26th of February. That's really, really early. And released from the Army altogether on the 22nd of March. This is a speed record. And it bothered me. How the hell did this happen? So I go through, and I finally pick up, his discharge medical. I'm pouring through to see if there's any sort of long-term disability. And it suddenly struck me, I found the answer right there. It's the only package in the service documents that lists his real birthday. And so I have a feeling that sometime, a couple of weeks after November 11th, he probably had a conversation with someone like, Sarge, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm only 17. And then, okay, kid, we're sending you home as fast as we can, because he's in France illegally. And basically that was the whole process of discovering the story of my grandfather and his brother. And again, the research was really quite simple. Anyone can do it. I'm now at the stage now where I can pull down almost all the information I need to know someone's story in about 25 minutes online. A little bit of practice, you can do the same thing. However, you're going to have questions about other cases. Our World War II research. If you are a relative, you can get the service package for someone who fell. If someone died in World War II, you can retrieve the package. I did for my uncle who died with the RCAF and learned all his story. Anyone else, you can't get it. Because after all, they still might be alive. And so there's privacy concerns, there's security concerns. So if you're planning on looking at what Dad was doing in World War II, if he came home in 1945, 46, forget about it. If he died, then you can order the package, and of course the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, again, will always tell you what happened. If you have someone who's in the British Army, well, about 60% of the British service packages, document packages in the First World War were destroyed by fire by the Luftwaffe in 1940. So a lot of their documentation is really incomplete. The other thing is that the British are looking at millions and millions of records. So they haven't got the same sort of internet support service that we have. If you want to look up someone's service documents who's serving the British military, you actually have to go to the National Archives at Kew. Now, they're well set up for visitors. They've all got all the documents are on microfiche. They'll be pleased to see you and support you as much as you can, because you'll be there that day with maybe about 4,000 to 5,000 other people, all intent on the same thing. But it's not on the internet. They're only now starting to get some documents scanned in as PDF files and basically based on the internet, but it's being done in partnership with Ancestry.com. So in other words, you want to look it up and get some of the records back, you have to pay for it. So the free access that we've got isn't there. It might be cheaper than spending a couple of days in Kew in England, but it still won't be limited. And if you're looking at the World War I record, there's about a 60% chance it won't be complete. In fact, you just might get medical records, a couple of other minor points. German records, that's even worse. All the World War I records were destroyed in a bombing raid. The federal records were destroyed in a bombing raid in February 1945, so they haven't got them. What they do have, though, Germans being Germans and liking to list things, there are partial databases here and there, for troops from Bavaria or troops from Hessians before they actually joined the National Army. So there's partial lists. They've also got some lists of wounded soldiers. They've also got separate lists of officers. And some of these are held in state archives. Some are held in federal archives. But if you want to look up German records, you've got to do an awful lot of ferreting to get the picture. In fact, actually, World War II is a little simpler than World War I, but World War I is really interesting. Now, just to complete the triumvirate, if you were looking, say, for an American relative, again, their World War I records were lost in a warehouse fire in 1960. So again, their records and their service packages from the First World War are woefully incomplete. Again, it's very, very hard to do your digging to find anything on that. Fortunately, the Veterans Administration, if they went back into hospital, if they were still alive after 1960 with complaints about World War I service, there might be a partial record available. But it's really hard to do American World War I research. And as for the Russians, forget it. You haven't even got a prayer. Anyway, that's all I've got for the moment. I'm willing to and quite happy to take any questions.
I was in Wales a few years ago, and I was visiting a place called Waddle Castle. It was a bus trip, and on the journey we stopped off at this place at a little, it was the White Church. And I was surprised to see a graveyard of all World War I Canadian soldiers. And I thought it was some kind of revolt or other, that happened in Wales in World War I.
There was a riot in April. This is, again, with the rising tensions from all these soldiers who are waiting to go home. And a lot of them were being shipped out of Wales, and there's one particular camp, the surface conditions, the canteen privileges, frustration and boredom had just got combined into a deadly cocktail, and there was a riot in which a number of people were killed. You had a question?
Yes. For the World War I public records, would those include deaths in military hospitals, within 4 or 5 years after the end of the war?
Would World War I public records include deaths that happened 4 or 5 years after the war?
Not during wartime, but as a result of the war in military hospitals.
I'm really glad you asked that question because I can actually answer it. For parsimonious reasons of public policy and the public purse, the Canadian government cut off war deaths in 1922. So if you lingered on a few years and died of your ailments, you died on your own ticket. I noticed when I was doing the work, going over the records for the 20th Battalion, the Regimental Association kept their own nominal roll, well up to 1928. And people who'd, and this is quite interesting also considering our current interest in post-traumatic stress syndrome, that people who died as a result of a lingering injury or who took their own lives, and it was deemed by their peers in the Regimental Association that it was because of stress from the war, were included in the nominal roll as war dead, even though Ottawa wouldn't actually list them that way. They had about 1,600 who died during the war, or 1915 to 1922, or of their injuries, and about another 45 or so who went in the 1920s because of injuries or taking their own lives. Yes?
It's more a point of information. I was hoping you would mention that the 13th Battalion was one of the 3 raised by the 5th Royal Highlanders of Canada, which later became the Black Watch of Canada.
Well, the 13th, yeah, actually. The Royal Highlanders of Canada, and they're still around. They perpetuate, of course, those 3 battalions, including the 13th. I thought I'd actually try and see if I could dig up any more information on my great-uncle from them, but they just weren't prepared to support inquiries like that.
I do have the nominal rolls of the 13th, 42nd, and 73rd regiments, which shows the date that they embarked from Canada, actually the ship they embarked on. I could look it up.
Does it include actually the dates they became casualties as well?
No, this would be the nominal rolls of the people who left Canada.
Oh, okay. No, I'd be interested. Just in one more line that, because I did write up these whole histories for the extended family about everybody that we'd had. Yes?
John, my family were basically in the British Army in the First World War. And are the British unit histories, all of my relatives' service files went up in that 60%. So I can't find anything about them. And I can't even find out what unit they were actually in. Are unit files online yet?
Well, since 1940, they've been trying to reconstruct as many of the records as they can. But again, that's all been centralized to the National Archive in Kew. So you might get, if you were to go there, you might get a partial response. But, a partial record, but you wouldn't get a complete record.
Yeah, I tried that a few years ago. I haven't tried it recently. If anything's changed.
Yeah, no, not really. Again, though, if they were killed, then that's quite simple. The Commonwealth War Graves, and that's all you need to do.
They were lucky enough to survive.
Yeah.
One that was an old contemptible.
Well, the records that went up in flames were also the people who'd been injured and come home. So now anyone who might conceivably ask for a pension from the British government for disability was in the warehouse that got firebombed. So everybody else who came home healthy and hale, or without a scratch, or was left before the end of the war, those records are fine. But the ones that say someone who's in frontline service in France, they are burned records, as the British archivists refer to them.
John, you mentioned that for records of Second World War fallen, these could be obtained if you're a relative. Do you know offhand what kind of documentation required to prove that you're a relative? It's not always so easy to do.
When you go to the Archives of Canada, they'll give you the instructions, including what documentation you provide to prove that you are a relative. So they'll be asking for a photocopy of a few documents like your birth certificate, your social insurance card, that sort of thing, just to make sure that they know who you are and you're not trying to get somebody's identity for purposes of exploiting it later. But you will get the complete service package, and it's actually better documented than the First World War records are.
I was going to say, they're fairly liberal. When I asked for my father's war record, World War II, and he died just a few years ago, I actually sent a picture of his grave, which is close by. It happens to have my name and my brother's on it, and they accepted that.
My problem is from the maternal side of the family, and it's a different name, so that's where I'm going to run into a problem.
But they will give a liberal determination.
Hopefully, thank you.
Yeah, well, you know, my great uncle Tom Main, who was killed, that was easy. Trying to look up my uncle who. Patrick Thompson, that was impossible because he was still alive, even though he was, you know, well gone in Alzheimer's at the time. I could try again, you know, maybe or do it through my cousins if I can talk them into doing it. The other one, of course, is that my father's oldest brother was actually a ward of the family, so a different last name, and trying to get his records was next to impossible. You know, they just weren't even going to entertain the request at all.
On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for joining us by podcast. We look forward to having you with us for future events, whether via internet or, we hope, in person. Either way, thanks for being with us, and goodbye for now.